The Allied invasion of Europe should have failed on the first beach. In the first hours, with the first waves of men, American troops landed without the support they were promised. Bombs missed. Naval guns fell silent too soon. Tanks sank before reaching shore. This was not a surprise to the British. They had learned the hard way that modern war destroys armies that rely on plans instead of experience. They believed the Americans were about to learn that lesson the same way everyone else had. When Omaha Beach collapsed into chaos, British commanders did not see heroism. They saw confirmation. An untested army. A plan in ruins. Losses no force should absorb and continue fighting. By every rule of warfare, the assault should have ended there. But it didn't. Something happened on that beach that morning that broke every expectation the British had formed over years of combat. The Americans did not fight correctly. They did not fight efficiently. They did not fight the way wars were supposed to be fought. They fought in a way that should not have worked. And yet, it changed everything. If you stay with this story, you will see why the moment that looked like proof of American weakness became the reason British generals were forced to rethink the war, and why an invasion that should have collapsed quietly shifted the balance of power in Europe. This is the part of D-Day most people never hear. The British did not doubt American courage. They doubted something far more dangerous to get wrong. They doubted whether an army that had never faced sustained, modern, industrial warfare could survive its first real test when everything went wrong at once. By 1944, British generals were not theorists. They were survivors. They had watched confident plans collapse in France in 1940. They had seen one of the largest armies in Europe disintegrate in weeks. They had stood on the beaches at Dunkirk, evacuating under fire, learning what happened when optimism met German machine guns. They had lost Singapore not to a stronger force, but to a faster, more aggressive one. They had watched Crete fall to airborne assault. They had fought in North Africa and Italy, discovering again and again that German units rarely broke when expected and often counterattacked when plans assumed they were finished. From these defeats, Britain absorbed a brutal lesson. War punishes inexperience immediately. By the time the Americans arrived in force, British officers had already been shaped by failure. Caution was not weakness to them. It was survival. So when American planners argued for a direct, daylight assault across the English Channel against the strongest coastal defenses in the world, British doubts were not emotional. They were analytical. To British eyes, the American army looked powerful, but unfinished. It had immense industrial backing. Its supply chains were unmatched. Its equipment was abundant. But its soldiers were new to the kind of war Britain had been fighting since 1939. Many American units were built around National Guard formations, citizen soldiers, men who had trained seriously, but had not yet learned what happened when plans collapsed. Leaders were killed, and fear took over. The British had seen exactly how that story usually ended. They had also seen how doctrine failed under pressure. British military thinking by 1944 was built around control. Clear chains of command, coordinated movement between infantry, armor, artillery, and air power. Nothing was left to improvisation if it could be avoided, because improvisation usually meant chaos, and chaos usually meant defeat. The American approach looked different. American doctrine accepted disorder more easily. It assumed momentum could compensate for friction. It believed that speed, mass, and initiative could overwhelm even well-prepared defenses. To British officers, this looked reckless. Not foolish, but dangerously optimistic. The disagreement was never about whether Americans were brave. No British general doubted that. The doubt was about whether bravery mattered when men were pinned down by machine gun fire, when communications failed, and when armored support did not arrive. History suggested it did not. British generals had learned that courage without experience burned out quickly, that soldiers could fight fiercely for minutes or hours, but sustained pressure revealed cracks that training alone could not fill. That belief shaped British strategy. They preferred attrition, peripheral campaigns, wearing the enemy down, forcing Germany to bleed in multiple theaters until a decisive strike was unavoidable and survivable. The Americans rejected this. They believed delay cost lives, that the fastest way to end the war was to strike directly at the heart of German power in Western Europe. That overwhelming force, properly planned, could shatter defenses before the enemy could react. Two allies, two worldviews, and beneath the cooperation, a quiet question lingered. What happens when the plan fails? For the British, this was not a theoretical concern. It was the central problem of war. They had learned that no plan survived first contact with the enemy, that bombardments missed, that intelligence was incomplete, that weather intervened. That men panicked. When those things happened, doctrine mattered, experience mattered, and armies that had not learned these lessons the hard way often paid for them in blood. This was why Omaha Beach worried British commanders more than any other sector. Not because Americans were weak, but because the margin for error there was non-existent. A narrow beach, high bluffs, interlocking German fields of fire, limited exits. If momentum stalled, there would be nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to regroup, nowhere to hide. Things went wrong at Omaha, they would go wrong immediately. And when the first reports arrived on the morning of June 6th, they described exactly what British generals had feared. Landing craft scattered, units disorganized, heavy casualties, no rapid breakthrough, no clear control. To British eyes, this did not look like a temporary setback. It looked like the beginning of a collapse they had seen before. What the British did not yet understand was that the American army was about to reveal something they had never faced in this form. Not superior doctrine, not better planning, but a way of continuing to fight when doctrine disappeared entirely. That realization would not come from speeches or reports. It would come from watching an army refuse to stop even after the reasons to stop became overwhelming. British commanders in 1944, the American army did not look weak. It looked unfinished. The difference mattered. British officers were used to armies that had been slowly carved into shape by failure. Units that survived France, North Africa, and Italy were no longer defined by theory. They were defined by scars, by habits formed under fire, by commanders who had learned when to push, when to wait, and when to stop before disaster became irreversible. The American army had not gone through that process. Most American divisions arriving in Britain had been built rapidly, expanded rapidly, and trained intensively, but training was not combat. Exercises ended when mistakes were made. War did not. British officers understood this distinction better than most because they had once been the inexperienced army themselves. In 1939, Britain had entered the war confident in professionalism and tradition. Within a year, that confidence had been shattered. Only those who adapted survived. By 1944, the British Army no longer trusted optimism. The Americans still did. American soldiers were citizen soldiers, not in the symbolic sense, but structurally. Many had been civilians only months before. Factory workers, students, clerks, mechanics, men who had answered a call to arms, trained hard, and believed they were ready. The British did not doubt their motivation. They doubted whether motivation survived the first hours of sustained fire, because British experience suggested it often didn't. The American command structure reinforced those doubts. American doctrine placed significant emphasis on initiative. Junior officers were encouraged to act aggressively, to exploit opportunity, to push forward rather than wait. In theory, this made American units flexible and fast. In practice, British officers worried it would make them unstable under pressure. Too much initiative without experience could become disorder. Too much aggression without coordination could become slaughter. British doctrine, by contrast, had grown rigid for a reason. It emphasized discipline, synchronization, and control. Infantry advanced with armor. Artillery was carefully coordinated. Timetables were conservative. Objectives were limited. Risk was managed. This approach was slower, but it kept units intact. To British eyes, the American style looked dangerous in a situation where mistakes could not be corrected. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the plan for Omaha Beach. Omaha was not forgiving terrain. It offered no wide maneuver space, no natural cover, no easy exits. Every assumption had to be correct, because there would be no second chance. British planners understood this. That was why they worried about the American reliance on bombardment. Bombardment was supposed to do the work that experience usually did. Airstrikes would break defenses. Naval guns would suppress strong points. Tanks would provide immediate fire support. If those things worked, even green troops could advance. If they didn't, the men on the beach would be exposed to the full weight of German fire with nothing to fall back on. British officers had seen bombardments fail before. Weather intervened. Intelligence was wrong. Targets survived. Guns reopened. Defenders adapted. That was not a hypothetical risk. It was a pattern. The Americans accepted that risk because their entire approach depended on momentum. Once the landing began, it had to keep moving forward. Delay meant disaster. The British understood something else. Momentum without control could accelerate failure. This difference in thinking created a quiet but profound unease. British officers did not argue openly that the Americans were unfit. Diplomacy mattered. Alliance mattered. But privately, many believed the Americans were about to encounter war at its most unforgiving without having paid the entry price. And that price was experience. The British had paid it in blood years earlier. They had learned that men panic when leaders fall, that units fragment when communications break, that courage does not move forward without structure. They had learned that the first hours of combat were the most dangerous because illusions still existed. The American army, in British eyes, was still full of illusions. Illusions about planning, illusions about firepower, illusions about how much control commanders retained once the shooting started. Omaha Beach was where those illusions would be tested. And if the British were right, the test would be brutal. Because Omaha offered no margin for learning. There would be no gradual adaptation, no time to recover from early mistakes, no space to reorganize after initial losses. An army either moved forward or it stayed pinned until it broke. This was why British concern hardened into skepticism, not because they wanted the Americans to fail, but because history suggested they might. And when the first reports from Omaha described confusion, stalled advances, and mounting casualties, British commanders did not reach for new explanations. They reached for old ones. They believed they were watching the predictable consequences of an army meeting modern warfare before it was ready. What they did not yet understand was that the American army was about to demonstrate a form of resilience that did not fit British models at all. Not resilience built on doctrine. Not resilience built on experience. But resilience built on something far less orderly and far more difficult to stop once it began. Overlord was not designed to be elegant. It was designed to be final. By the spring of 1944, the Allies were running out of acceptable alternatives. The war in Europe had reached a point where delay carried its own costs. Every month Germany held the Atlantic Wall. Civilians died under bombing campaigns. Soldiers died in peripheral theaters. And the Soviet Union continued to absorb catastrophic losses in the East. A second front was no longer a strategic option. It was a political and moral obligation. For the Americans, this was clear. They believed the war could not be ended without a decisive blow in Western Europe. Germany had to be confronted directly, on ground that mattered, with enough force to break its ability to maneuver and recover. For the British, the calculation was more complicated. They understood the necessity of invasion. They did not dispute that. What they disputed was the assumption that it could be controlled once it began. Because Overlord was not a battle, it was a chain reaction. Once the first soldiers landed, everything else depended on momentum. Supplies, reinforcements, artillery, armor, airfields. If the beachheads did not hold, nothing behind them could function. There would be no reset. This was why the plan was built on layers of assumptions. Assumptions about weather, assumptions about German strength, assumptions about how long defenses could be suppressed, assumptions about how quickly men could move inland. Every one of those assumptions had to be correct, not eventually, but immediately. British officers saw the danger in that. They had learned that war punished compound assumptions. One failure exposed another, one delay magnified the next. Small errors became catastrophic not because they were large, but because they happened simultaneously. Omaha Beach sat at the center of that risk. Geographically, it was the weakest point in the American sector. Tactically, it was the most unforgiving. Unlike other landing zones, Omaha offered little room for adjustment. High ground dominated the beach. Exits were limited. Defensive fire could be concentrated with lethal efficiency. If momentum stalled there, it would not recover easily. This was why British planners worried less about American bravery and more about American dependence on the plan. The plan assumed that preliminary firepower would compensate for inexperience. Airstrikes would soften defenses. Naval guns would suppress strong points. Armor would arrive early to provide immediate support. If those conditions were met, even green troops could succeed. But if they were not, the men on the beach would face veteran German units without cover, coordination, or depth. British experience suggested that was how disasters began. And yet, despite these concerns, the plan moved forward. Because there was no version of Overlord that did not involve risk. There was only a choice between a controlled gamble now and a prolonged war with no clear end. In that sense, the British accepted Overlord not because they believed it was safe, but because it was unavoidable. What unsettled them was not the risk itself. It was how much depended on American performance in the first hours. The Americans would be carrying the heaviest burden of the invasion. Their beaches were expected to absorb the largest forces, push inland fastest, and link up with British and Canadian units to form a continuous front. If the Americans failed, the entire structure collapsed asymmetrically. British success could not compensate for American failure. This reality shaped British expectations on the morning of June 6th. They did not expect perfection. They did not expect smooth execution. But they believed that once the plan broke, and it would break, the American army would face its defining test. Not of courage, but of cohesion. Could an army built rapidly, trained intensively, and still learning the nature of modern combat continue fighting when its assumptions dissolved? British history suggested most could not. In previous wars, armies that lost their structure early often lost everything else soon after. Units that stalled under fire tended to disintegrate rather than adapt. Retreat followed confusion. Confusion followed loss of control. This was the nightmare scenario for Omaha. Not a dramatic defeat, but a quiet paralysis. Men pinned down. Officers killed. Clear authority. No coordinated movement. Reinforcements arriving into chaos instead of order. From that point, evacuation became a rational consideration. British commanders understood this logic intimately. They had lived through it themselves. So when early reports from Omaha described scattered landings, heavy casualties, and a lack of forward movement, British concern sharpened. Not because the Americans were failing faster than expected, but because they were failing in exactly the way British experience predicted. What British commanders could not see yet was that the American army was about to confront the plan's collapse in a way that did not fit British models. The plan would not recover, but the invasion would, not through discipline, not through doctrine, but through something far messier and far more dangerous to underestimate. The plan did not fail gradually. It failed all at once. Within minutes of the first landings at Omaha Beach, the assumptions that held Operation Overlord together began to collapse. The air strikes that were supposed to break the defenses missed their targets. The naval bombardment ended before it achieved decisive suppression. The armored support that infantry depended on never arrived. None of this was visible to the men offshore who had approved the plan. But it was immediately obvious to the men stepping off the landing craft. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was exposure. Infantry units came ashore under direct machine gun and mortar fire, with no effective cover and no coordinated support. Men were hit before they could orient themselves. Others drowned under the weight of their equipment. The beach filled with bodies, burning craft, and wreckage that blocked movement and shredded formations. This was the moment British commanders had feared. Not because losses were heavy, losses were expected, but because control disappeared. The chain of command did not break cleanly. It fragmented. Officers were killed or pinned down. Radios failed. Units landed in the wrong sectors. Timetables became meaningless. Orders could not be transmitted, let alone executed. Doctrine offered no answers here. British military thinking assumed that when plans broke, control had to be restored before progress could resume. Units regrouped. Firepower was re-coordinated. Momentum paused to prevent collapse. At Omaha, that was impossible. There was no space to regroup, no safe rear area, no clear line separating front from rear. Men who stopped moving became targets. For British observers, This was the critical threshold. An army that lost coherence at this stage usually did not recover. It froze, withdrew, or collapsed entirely. The terrain amplified every failure. Omaha was a killing ground designed for defenders. The beach offered little cover. The exits were narrow and easily controlled. Fire from above could sweep every approach. Movement drew attention. Stillness invited death. This was not a situation that rewarded caution. It punished it. The doctrine that Britain had spent years refining deliberate movement, tight coordination, controlled advance, had no place here. And the American doctrine that relied on preparation and firepower was equally powerless. What remained was not a system. It was a test of human behavior under extreme pressure. Most armies in history broke at this point, not because they lacked courage, but because fear and confusion overwhelmed structure. Men clung to the ground. Units waited for orders that never came. Initiative died with leadership. British commanders had seen this happen repeatedly in earlier campaigns. They believed they were watching it again. Reports from Omaha described stalled advances, rising casualties, and no clear breakthrough. Reinforcements were arriving into chaos rather than order. Equipment was piling up on the beach instead of moving inland. From a staff officer's perspective, this was the worst possible outcome. The invasion was not being repelled decisively, but it was not progressing either. That meant time, and time favored the defenders. Every minute the Americans remained pinned increased the risk that German reserves would counterattack. Every delay reduced the chance that the beachhead could be expanded before nightfall. For the British, this was the point at which logic overtook hope. If the Americans could not regain control soon, evacuation would become the only rational option. This was not cowardice. It was mathematics. An army bleeding on an exposed beach without momentum could not sustain itself indefinitely. Staying longer without progress meant more dead with no strategic gain. British commanders understood this calculus intimately because they had made similar decisions before. Dunkirk was not remembered as a victory, but it was remembered as survival. Knowing when to withdraw had saved an army that could fight another day. The question now was whether Omaha was becoming another Dunkirk or something worse. What British observers did not yet grasp was that the American response to this collapse would not follow the pattern they expected. Instead of attempting to restore order from the top down, the American army began adapting from the bottom up. Small groups formed without orders. Junior leaders took initiative without guidance. Men moved because staying still meant dying, not because a plan demanded it. This was not doctrine. It was instinct. From a British perspective, this should have accelerated failure. Uncoordinated movement usually produced greater casualties and faster collapse. But on Omaha Beach, something counterintuitive began to happen. Disorder did not paralyze the assault. It reshaped it. The invasion did not recover its plan. It abandoned it. And in doing so, it crossed a line most armies never survive crossing. From that moment forward, Omaha Beach was no longer governed by strategy or doctrine. It was governed by individuals making irreversible decisions under fire. That was not supposed to work, and yet, for reasons that were not yet visible from command ships or headquarters, it began to. Omaha Beach, survival did not come from restoring order. It came from accepting that order was gone. Most armies are trained to fight within structure. Orders flow downward. Units move according to plan. When contact with the enemy disrupts that structure, the instinct is to pause, regroup, and re-establish control. At Omaha, pausing meant death. The American assault reached a point where waiting for coordination was more dangerous than acting alone. Radios were silent. Senior officers were dead or pinned down. Landing zones were wrong. Timetables were meaningless. There was no higher authority to appeal to. So the American army did something the British had not expected. It decentralized itself. Not by doctrine, not by command, but by necessity. Small groups of men began forming organically, not because they belonged together on paper, but because they happened to be near one another when the firing became unbearable. A sergeant here, a lieutenant there, sometimes just a private who understood that lying still was a slower way to die. These groups did not wait for permission. They moved because movement created a chance, however small, to escape the killing ground of the beach. This behavior violated almost every principle British doctrine emphasized. It was uncoordinated. It was inefficient. It was dangerous. And yet, It worked. The American training system, intentionally or not, had produced soldiers who were accustomed to making decisions without perfect information. Citizen soldiers were not professional automatons. They were used to solving problems with incomplete guidance. That habit mattered now. British training emphasized adherence to plan because plans preserved lives when they worked. American training tolerated deviation because deviation preserved momentum when plans failed. At Omaha, only one of those approaches could function. As individual groups pushed forward, something critical happened. German defenders, trained to repel coordinated assaults, found themselves facing unpredictable pressure. Fire that had been calibrated for massed movement now had to respond to scattered threats from unexpected angles. This did not neutralize the defenses. It complicated them. Machine gun nests designed to sweep beaches were less effective against small groups climbing at irregular points. Mortar fire registered on expected routes became less lethal when those routes were ignored. The Americans were not advancing efficiently. They were advancing unevenly, but uneven movement was enough. Each small success mattered. A wire obstacle breached, a bunker silenced, a path found up a bluff. None of these actions changed the battle alone. Together, they changed its direction. British observers had difficulty categorizing what they were seeing. This was not a breakthrough in the traditional sense. There was no line advancing, no synchronized push. But the Americans were no longer static. The moment an army stops losing ground and starts gaining it, even in fragments, the psychological balance shifts. This is the moment many battles turn. The Americans crossed that threshold not through command, but through accumulation. 100 small decisions made by men with no assurance of success. From the British perspective, this behavior was alarming. It looked undisciplined. It looked chaotic. It looked like the kind of improvisation that usually ended in disaster. But the disaster did not arrive. Instead, something else did. Persistence. The American assault did not surge forward. It ground forward. Groups moved, were hit, regrouped, and moved again. Losses continued. Progress was slow, but it did not stop. German defenders began reporting a problem they had not anticipated. They were running out of time. Not because they were being overwhelmed tactically, but because the Americans refused to disengage. Casualties that should have forced withdrawal did not. Pressure that should have eased did not. From a defensive standpoint, this was unsettling. Defenders rely on the attacker's breaking point. They expect assaults to pause, to reorganize, to retreat. When that rhythm fails, defenders are forced to adapt under stress. At Omaha, the Americans disrupted that rhythm. They did not attack in waves after the initial landing. They attacked in fragments, continuously. This was not elegant warfare. Denied the defenders a clear moment of relief. British commanders watching this did not immediately reinterpret American doctrine. What they recognized first was simpler and more troubling. The Americans were not behaving like an army that knew when it was beaten. They were absorbing punishment beyond what British experience suggested was sustainable. This was the paradox. By every professional standard, the Americans should have disengaged. Losses were extreme. Coordination was minimal. Support was incomplete. Yet they continued, not recklessly but stubbornly. British military history was filled with examples of disciplined withdrawals that preserved fighting strength. The American behavior at Omaha looked like the opposite. And yet, it achieved what withdrawal could not. It kept the beach contested. That single fact mattered more than everything else. As long as American troops remained engaged on Omaha, the invasion lived. German forces could not be fully redirected elsewhere. Reserves remained uncertain. Counterattacks were delayed. The beach did not have to be secure. It only had to exist. This was the realization that began to unsettle British assumptions. The American army was not succeeding because it followed doctrine better. It was succeeding because it refused to accept the logic that said it should stop. That refusal was not random. It was rooted in a system that placed responsibility low, tolerated initiative, and accepted disorder when order was impossible. The British had spent years minimizing those traits. At Omaha, those traits became decisive. This did not mean British doctrine was wrong. It meant it was incomplete. The Americans had revealed a form of resilience that did not depend on structure surviving intact. It depended on enough individuals continuing to move forward when structure disappeared. That was not how the British believed wars should be fought, but it was how Omaha Beach was taken. Commanders did not change their minds because the Americans won. They changed their minds because the Americans refused to lose. From headquarters and command ships, the picture that emerged from Omaha Beach was deeply uncomfortable. It did not resemble success. It did not resemble competence. It did not resemble anything the British would have called a properly conducted assault. And yet, it also did not resemble collapse. For men trained to read battles through patterns, advance, stall, withdraw, Omaha defied classification. There was no clean breakthrough. There was no organized withdrawal. There was only continued pressure. British officers had expected the American assault to reach a breaking point. Not immediately, but inevitably. Every army had one. The British had learned to recognize the signs: stalled movement, rising casualties, exhausted units, loss of cohesion. Those signs were present at Omaha. What was missing was the outcome they usually produced. Instead of disengaging, the Americans persisted, not in a disciplined, methodical way, but in a manner that made prediction impossible. From a British perspective, this was unsettling. They were watching an army operate without the safeguards they believed prevented disaster. Units were not advancing according to plan. Fire support was uneven. Coordination was improvised. Leadership was often informal, yet progress, however limited, continued. This forced British commanders to confront an uncomfortable distinction. They had assumed that discipline and experience were prerequisites for endurance, that once an army exceeded acceptable losses without achieving objectives, withdrawal was the rational response. What they were witnessing suggested another possibility. An army could endure without elegance, without efficiency, without certainty, so long as it did not accept defeat. British doctrine had evolved to minimize unnecessary sacrifice. It valued conservation of force. It assumed that preserving an army was often more important than holding ground temporarily. The American behavior at Omaha inverted that logic. They accepted losses that British officers would have judged unsustainable not because they were indifferent to life, but because their calculation was different. The beach mattered more than the cost already paid. This difference was not philosophical in the abstract. It was operational. As long as American troops remained engaged on Omaha, German forces could not reallocate decisively. The defensive effort had to remain distributed. Pressure elsewhere could not be fully concentrated. From a strategic perspective, persistence itself became a weapon. British commanders understood this immediately. They had practiced deception, diversion, and attrition for years. They knew the value of forcing an enemy to commit resources inefficiently. What surprised them was that this effect was being achieved not through careful orchestration, but through refusal to disengage. The Americans were not outmaneuvering the Germans. They were exhausting them. This realization did not produce admiration. It produced recalculation. British officers began reassessing assumptions they had held for years. Perhaps endurance did not always require perfect control. Perhaps cohesion could be replaced, temporarily, by momentum. Perhaps an army could survive chaos if enough individuals continued acting decisively. None of these ideas fit comfortably within British military culture. They contradicted lessons learned at great cost earlier in the war. And yet, Omaha forced the issue. Because the Americans were not winning in theory. They were winning in practice. British commanders also noticed something else. The Americans adapted faster than expected. Not at the level of doctrine or command directives, but at the level that mattered most in that moment. They identified exits. They exploited weak points. They adjusted movement without waiting for formal approval. This adaptability did not erase losses. It prevented paralysis. In British experience, paralysis was usually fatal. That it did not occur at Omaha challenged one of their deepest assumptions, that inexperience inevitably led to collapse under sustained fire. The Americans were inexperienced. They were also still advancing. This forced British commanders to separate two ideas they had previously treated as inseparable. Experience and resilience were not the same thing. Experience produced efficiency. Resilience produced survival. At Omaha, survival was enough. British observers did not conclude that the American way of war was superior. They did not abandon their own methods. They did not suddenly trust American judgment in all matters. What changed was narrower and more important. They no longer doubted that American forces could endure the worst conditions modern warfare could impose. That doubt had shaped British behavior since the Americans entered the war. It had influenced planning, command relationships, and strategic disagreements. Omaha weakened it, not because the Americans proved flawless, they clearly did not, but because they proved unbreakable in circumstances that should have broken them. This was not a comfortable realization. If the Americans could fight this way, the balance within the alliance would change. British influence had been built on experience, on the belief that they understood war better because they had suffered longer. Omaha suggested that suffering alone did not define capability. The Americans had learned something essential in a single morning, and they had learned it at a cost that could not be ignored. By the end of June 6th, British commanders were no longer asking whether the Americans could fight. They were asking a different question. How would a war be shaped by an army willing to absorb chaos and keep going? Recognition came before reconciliation. British commanders did not emerge from June 6th convinced that the American way of war was superior. They emerged convinced of something narrower and more consequential. The Americans could fight. That conclusion did not erase years of experience, nor did it dissolve deep disagreements about how wars should be conducted. It changed the terms of those disagreements. Before Omaha, British criticism of American methods was existential. It questioned whether American forces could be trusted with decisive responsibility. After Omaha, the criticism became technical. Not can they fight, but how they fight. That distinction mattered. British officers continued to view American operations as inefficient. They believed American forces attacked along fronts that were too wide, expended resources too freely, and accepted casualties that a more deliberate approach might avoid. Those criticisms did not disappear. They sharpened, because now the Americans were no longer untested partners. They were a force whose decisions carried irreversible consequences. British military culture had been shaped by scarcity, limited manpower, limited industrial depth. Every loss felt permanent. Efficiency was not elegance, it was necessity. American culture was shaped by abundance. Men, machines, ammunition flowed in volumes Britain could not match. Time favored American production in a way it never favored British survival earlier in the war. These differences produced incompatible instincts. British commanders prioritized control to minimize loss. American commanders prioritized momentum to maximize effect. After Omaha, neither side could dismiss the other outright, but neither side could fully adopt the other's approach. This created a new kind of tension. The British no longer doubted American resolve. They doubted American judgment. And the Americans, having survived the worst test imaginable, grew less patient with British caution. They had paid in blood. They had learned under fire. They were no longer inclined to defer. This shift altered the alliance in subtle but profound ways. Command relationships became more contested. Strategic debates became sharper. Cooperation continued, but on more equal terms. For British officers accustomed to leading by experience, this was uncomfortable. Their authority had been moral as much as operational. They had endured longer. They had lost more earlier. They believed that gave them a right to caution others. After Omaha, that authority weakened. Experience no longer belonged exclusively to Britain. The Americans had earned it in the most unforgiving way possible. British commanders recognized this even as they resisted its implications. They continued to emphasize combined arms discipline. They continued to advocate methodical advances. They continued to criticize American aggressiveness when it produced high casualties. But they no longer questioned American capacity to recover from those losses. This was a dangerous acknowledgement. An ally who can absorb punishment and keep advancing becomes difficult to restrain. British planners understood that an army willing to accept chaos might also be willing to accept risk levels Britain found unacceptable. This did not make the Americans reckless. It made them decisive. That decisiveness would increasingly shape operations in Western Europe. As American forces expanded and British forces contracted, the balance within the alliance shifted further. Decisions that once required British approval increasingly moved forward with American momentum. This was not a coup. It was arithmetic. Men, matériel, and initiative were accumulating on one side. Omaha did not cause this shift alone, but it removed the last barrier to it, the belief that American forces required supervision. From that point forward, British influence relied less on seniority and more on persuasion. That was a change Britain could not reverse. The irony was difficult to ignore. The British had been right about many things. They had been right that the plan would fail in critical places. They had been right that bombardment would not solve everything. They had been right that chaos would dominate the battlefield. What they had been wrong about was what came next. They believed chaos produced collapse. At Omaha, chaos produced adaptation. It did not invalidate British doctrine. It revealed its limits. British methods excelled when structure could be maintained. American methods excelled when structure disintegrated. Neither was universally superior. But modern war increasingly created conditions where structure was fragile. That reality would favor one approach more often than the other. British commanders understood this even if they did not welcome it. They adjusted, not by abandoning their principles, but by recalibrating expectations. They stopped treating American forces as students. They began treating them as partners with a different risk tolerance. That change reshaped the conduct of the war. Disagreements continued. Clashes of personality persisted. Strategic arguments flared repeatedly in the months that followed. But the foundation beneath those arguments had shifted. They were no longer debates about capability. They were debates about cost. And in war, cost is inseparable from power. The Americans had demonstrated they were willing and able to pay a price others could not. That did not make them right in every decision. It made them impossible to ignore. By the time Allied forces pushed beyond the beaches and into the hedgerows of Normandy, the alliance was no longer operating on assumptions formed in conference rooms. It was operating on conclusions drawn from blood. Omaha Beach did not settle how the war should be fought. It settled who would have the weight to decide. Wars are not decided in moments of victory. They are decided in moments when belief collapses. Omaha Beach did not look like a turning point. There was no clean breakthrough, no decisive maneuver, no moment when victory was obvious. By conventional standards, it was one of the most chaotic and costly assaults of the war. And yet, the war in Western Europe changed there. Not because the Germans were defeated that morning, not because the Allies suddenly gained momentum, but because a fundamental assumption quietly died. Before June 6th, British commanders believed the Americans would eventually become effective after more time, more experience, more supervision. After June 6th, that belief was no longer necessary. The Americans had crossed the threshold that mattered. They had faced a situation that should have destroyed them and emerged intact enough to continue advancing. Not intact in numbers, not intact in organization, but intact in will. That distinction reshaped everything that followed. From that day forward, the question was no longer whether American forces could be trusted with decisive operations. It was how fast those operations would be pushed. As the campaign in Normandy continued, the differences between British and American approaches did not disappear. They became more pronounced. British forces advanced carefully through prepared positions, prioritizing control and minimizing risk. American forces pushed harder, accepted disorder, and absorbed losses in pursuit of speed. Both approaches had costs. Both approaches had advantages. But only one could be sustained at scale. As weeks turned into months, the arithmetic of war became unavoidable. American divisions multiplied. American supply lines expanded. American commanders increasingly set the tempo of operations. This was not because the British failed. It was because the Americans endured. Omaha had proven something that production statistics alone could not. That American forces could absorb the psychological and physical shocks of modern warfare without breaking. Once that was established, the outcome of the campaign became a matter of time. German commanders understood this too. The defenders at Omaha had inflicted losses that should have shattered an assault. They had executed their defenses competently. They had done what doctrine demanded. And it had not been enough. That realization spread quietly through German ranks in Normandy. If the Americans could not be stopped at the beaches, they could not be stopped inland. Delay was possible. Defeat was not. For the British, the implications were more complex. They had entered the alliance as teachers, as veterans guiding a younger partner through a war they already understood. After Omaha, That role could not be sustained. Experience no longer flowed in one direction. The alliance adjusted accordingly, not through declarations or reorganizations, but through behavior. American voices carried more weight in planning. American urgency shaped operational decisions. British caution remained influential, but no longer decisive by default. This shift did not weaken the alliance. It stabilized it. The Americans were no longer untested optimism. The British were no longer unquestioned authority. Each side now understood the other's strengths and limits more clearly. That understanding had been purchased at Omaha, at enormous cost. The men who paid that cost did not think in these terms. They were not aware of alliance dynamics or strategic balances. They were trying to survive the next minute, the next burst of fire, the next climb up a bluff. They did not know they were redefining how an army could fight, but they did. By refusing to disengage when logic said they should, they demonstrated a form of endurance that reshaped expectations across the Allied command structure. That endurance mattered far beyond June 6th. It shaped the breakout from Normandy. It shaped the pace of the advance across France. It shaped how risks were calculated for the rest of the war. And it shaped the post-war world. The alliance forged at Omaha did not end with Germany's defeat. It evolved into structures that defined the next half-century of global security. Cooperation between Britain and the United States did not become easier, but it became grounded in reality rather than assumption. That reality was forged under fire. The paradox of Omaha Beach is that it did not prove one doctrine right and another wrong. It proved that modern war rewards armies that can continue functioning after doctrine collapses. The Americans learned that lesson in a single morning. The British recognized it immediately. And the war moved forward on new terms. The invasion that should have failed did not succeed because it was well executed. It succeeded because enough men refused to accept the moment when failure made sense. That refusal changed the war before anyone had time to name it. And, by the time the world realized what had happened, the outcome was already decided.